Good. So everything's clear. One other question I like to ask also is you have to know the direction of the blood flow to the heart, the right order. Okay. Uh, and that is blood from the, as you can see here, in the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, goes into the right atrium, right ventricle, go through the tricuspid valve, into the pulmonary seminal valve, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary artery, into the lung, which get oxygenated, come back as pulmonary veins, oxygenated, come back as pulmonary veins, to the left ventricle, through the mitral valve, you see there, into the left ventricle, into the aortic seminal valve, into the aorta, to this arterial system here, capillary, venule system back, and so forth. So, in other words, you have to know this. Vena cava, right atrium, right ventricle, tricuspid pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries, lungs, pulmonary veins. Remember, here's the vein that carry oxygenated blood. Here's an artery that carry deoxygenated blood. But it does carry blood away from the heart, hence the name, the artery. And to the right, left atrium, left ventricle, to the mitral valve, left ventricle to the aorta via aortic seminal valve. Okay? Now, so that's the blood that flows through the heart. Okay? Now, the blood I mentioned earlier has blood, it requires its own blood supply. This is part of the coronary circuits. Okay? And the coronary circulation circulation. So you guys, you need to know where are these blood vessels. And an interesting thing is this, right? Let me go back. Okay, this one. Particular here, most of the artery in general will receive the blood when the heart contracts. Okay, heart contraction is known as systolic. Systolic is contraction. Or diastolic is when heart relaxation. Okay, so when you say that when the ventricle contract, as you can see here, the ventricle contract, the artery will receive the blood. Okay, the blood is actually leaving the heart in the artery, and when the artery receives the blood is going to go through the aorta into the abdomen, the thoracic aorta, into the abdominal aorta, and it goes into this, celiac trunk. So most of the artery will receive the blood when the heart contracts. Okay, but not coronary circulation. In the coronary circulation, it receives the blood when the heart is relaxing, and that is because sitting at the base of the aorta, particularly at the aortic seminal valve. Okay? So right about here, there's an opening. There's an opening. It goes this way. So this is on the right-hand side. This is known as the this is known as the right coronary artery. And there's another one over here. It's called the left coronary artery. Okay. Now, the reason why the coronary artery receives this blood during a heart relaxation, because after a contraction, right, blood goes out, and when the heart relaxes, blood trying to come back in, but we saw that it cannot get in, right? The aortic seminal valve sort of like close. Okay? In fact, that's generate the second heart sound. And so this area will be full with blood, right? above the aortic center valve, and then it starts to trickle down into the right coronary artery or into the left coronary artery. Okay. Okay, you can see here. So the left coronary, so your job is to understand where are these arteries and what does it do? Okay, it brings blood to what area? Well, the left coronary artery branches into the circumflex artery, okay, which is this one right here, runs in the back, and the circumflex that goes around, it's a circumference. Now, that's served on the left-hand side between the left atriums and the left ventricle, right? So typically, let's say, so let's say I'll draw a heart like this, 4-chamber, right? So the left coronary artery, start from an aorta, comes out like this, okay? Now it's going to go a little bit and then it branch, right? This one continue. This is known as the CF, the circumflex. And it will then brings this oxygen to the left atrium and the left ventricle, okay? But this one is continue like this. This is the anterior interventricular artery. Inter meaning it runs between the two ventricles. So the anterior interventricular is really serving the left ventricle and the right ventricle because it's run between. Okay. So the anterior interventricular serve the ventricular walls anteriorly. And here's the right coronary artery. It branches into this one right here is known as the marginal at the edge. That's the marginal artery right here. And the marginal artery sees sort of like kind of like the circumflex, and that is it serves the right ventricle, but also the right atrium up here a little bit as well. Okay. And this one continued to go in the back. The right coronary artery continued to go in the back to becomes the posterior interventricular artery, which serves posteriorly the wall of the ventricle. Now that's arterial system. So once the blood that is brought to this area and the areas use that oxygen, it's going to take drainage. Okay, drainage, you're going to have a similar blood that runs parallel to the anterior interventricular right here. This is on the great cardiac vein, and then one that runs right about here is called small cardiac vein, and the one back here is called the middle cardiac vein. But all those three veins takes drainage, and it dumps into posteriorly. There's a structure here known as coronary sinus, and then blood in the coronary sinus goes into the right atrium. So the right atrium will receive 3 blood supply: coronary sinus, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava. Okay. Now, if that doesn't make sense, this probably will help you make more sense. Okay. All right. So you can see this little. I'm going to show it to you. This right here. That's the right coronary artery. Now, the right coronary opens up at the base of the aortic seminal valve, or near the aortic seminal valve, right there. So that's the right coronary artery, branch into the marginal artery, which is this one, and then it goes all the way in the back. So this is the anterior view. This is the anterior view, and this is the posterior view. Daniela, you have a question?
I just wanted to tell
Daniela?
you that. I just wanted to tell you that your pointer wasn't working, but it's working now. Never mind.
Okay. This is the right coronary artery that branches into the marginal artery here, right? And then this one continued to go in the back, so posterior view, so you can see here. So it comes down to this. This is your posterior interventricular artery. Now, posterior interventricular brings the blood, it actually blood flow this way. It'll bring downward. Okay. Now, the right coronary artery runs a little bit, you can't really, sorry, the left coronary artery runs a little bit, right? And then it splits. It splits into this one right here called the circumflex. And then this one right here is the anterior interventricular artery. Okay. The anterior interventricular artery brings blood down, and it's actually serving these two ventricles over here. Because the anterior ventricular artery brings blood down, the anterior interventricular, also known as left anterior descending, or also known as the LAD blood vessel. Okay. And I use LAD oftentimes. You use LAD. LAD stands for left anterior descending. That's the same thing as the anterior interventricular artery. Okay. Now, running along. So here is the thing. The question is, running along the anterior interventricular artery. This is the anterior interventricular. Is what vein? Is this vein right here? It's called the great cardiac vein. Excuse me. The great cardiac vein. But the difference is that in the left anterior descending, blood goes down. But in the great cardiac vein, it's draining, right? So it's actually taking blood, thank you, going up. And blood in the great cardiac vein goes up. Where does it go? Right? It goes into this. That's a coronary sinus. Okay. And the coronary sinus in the back, and then blood in the coronary sinus goes into the right atrium. Similarly, running along the marginal artery here is a small cardiac vein. You should see it's a small cardiac vein, and the small cardiac vein would run all the way in the back as well. You flip it around. Right. So it also goes into the coronary sinus. Yeah, so it actually goes in there. And then you have the middle cardiac vein, which is this one right here, that run parallel along the posterior interventricular. That's just your middle cardiac vein. You see here? Middle cardiac vein that drains it into the coronary sinus. So another way is to look at and say, okay, here is your coronary circulation arterial supply. You see that little short segment? This is known as the left coronary artery. The left coronary artery branches into the circumflex, you see here, and how the circumflex go around. And then the anterior interventricular is this one. The right coronary artery branches into the marginal artery, and it comes back to the posterior interventricular. Now, what you also see is that oftentimes this thing right here, this is known as anastomosis. Now, anastomosis means is important. Let me write this down. Okay. So anastomosis meaning that there are blood supply, that area will receive blood supply from many sources. Or another word, you can say anastomosis is the area that blood vessel meet, if you will. Okay. And this is critical because if one area, one of the blood vessel is blocked, right, it seems like it can get blood supplies from somewhere else as well. So that's what we mean by anastomosis. It provides us blood supplies as to the area will get it from several blood supplies. All right, now if this is if this is the anterior interventricular artery, well, running along this will be the great cardiac vein. So here, as you can see here, this is the great cardiac vein. Okay. Now, blood in the great cardiac vein go upward now, right? And it goes all the way around, into the coronary sinus. Just like the small cardiac vein, go all the way around into coronary sinus, and the middle cardiac vein, which is running along with this, would be the posterior interventricular artery. So it's kind of like similar location into the coronary sinus, and blood in the coronary sinus goes into the right atrium. Okay, any questions so far? Alrighty, so that's the anatomy. Now we're going to do what we consider as more physiology. Okay? And the physiology is typically, one could break down the functions of the heart, right, from one contraction to the next contraction, right? So typically we call it lub up, lub up, lub up, lub up. The period from lub to lub, right, is one cardiac cycle, we call that, or dub to dub, right? So lub dub, lub dub, so lub to lub is one cardiac cycle. So in that cardiac cycle, a cardiac cycle is that time from lub dub to lub dub, okay? We can take this cardiac cycle and we can break it up, right? And look at what is the functions of the heart. We call it heart action. So the cardiac cycle is like, okay, within that cardiac cycle, there's two things that occur, right? We just say split in the middle. One thing is that the atrial contract, the ventricle relax. And then the ventricle contract, the atrial relax, right? So here is basically another way of looking at it. So the bottom line is that the ventricle has to be have certain volumes of blood, okay, in it, so that it can. That volumes of blood is known as end-diastolic volume. Okay, we'll talk about end-diastolic volume maybe a little bit. Which means is the volumes of blood at the end of the ventricle relaxation. That's what end-diastolic volume is. Now the end-diastolic volume is the volumes of blood that in the ventricle before the ventricle contraction. Roughly it's about 120 mLs of blood. Sometimes it goes 150 mLs of blood, but it's around that area. Okay. Now, venous return, when I talk about venous return, that means blood coming back to the heart. That's what venous return is. From three sources, right? We saw that superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and coronary sinus goes into the right atrium. Now, most of the blood that coming back to the heart is actually goes directly into the ventricle. In which case that the atrioventricular valve must be open so then it can comes down. So the event that you see is on the right side of the heart, very much similar to the left side of the heart, which is the blood that is coming back to the heart from the left-hand side to the lung, still venous return, but as a part of the pulmonary circuits will carry oxygenated blood. Most of the blood from the left atrium, in the left atrium, goes down to the left ventricle. So we call that as rapid filling. Most of the blood that coming back to the heart goes directly into the ventricle. About 70% of the blood that going back to the heart goes directly into the ventricle. Anyone have a problem with that? Okay, so then there, the two atria, or each of the atrium here, still have the remaining about 30% of the blood. It's there. So what is the purpose of the atrial contraction? You see here, atrial-systolic. Atrial-systolic, in essence, when it contracts, it wants that 30% of the blood in the atrium to goes down into the ventricle. So you kind of like, you squeeze it. So then all that blood can goes down to the ventricle. So the atrial contract to push the remaining 30% of blood down, right? And so at this time, of course, when the atrial contract, the ventricle is relaxing. Okay, most of the blood coming back to the heart, come to me, sits there. The atrial contract to push the remaining of the blood. Now you got your 100% of the blood is there, ready to go. That's about 120 mLs of blood, right? So the heart, the ventricle is in this relaxation state, so we call it ventricle diastolic, right? So right before the ventricle contract, there's a volumes of blood there. That volume of blood is known as EDV. Okay. EDV, just like the name implies, it is the end of the diastolic period or end diastolic volume. All right. So let's say it's about 120 ml, roughly. Okay. Of course, bigger person, or if you're an athlete, you have more blood volume, for example, and your stroke volume will be different. Okay, I'm going to explain that right now. At the end of the ventricle relaxation, the ventricle started to contract. When the ventricle contract, by the way, the atrial now relax. Okay, and so now the blood is in the ventricle on this side and on this side. Okay, it's about the same, in fact. Okay? It has to be the same, and the ventricle now contract and it pushes the blood on the right hand side into the pulmonary trunk, on the left hand side into the aorta. Right, it goes squeeze, squeeze the blood comes out. That blood that comes out is known as stroke volume. Stroke volume. Stroke volume is the volumes of blood that leaves the heart per contraction. Stroke. Let me write this down. Stroke volume is the amount of blood leaves the heart per contraction. I don't know if you can see this. All right here. Okay. So stroke volume, stroke volume, I think this is stroke, my bad, is stroke, S-T-R-O-K, okay, that's more sense. So stroke volume, okay, is the amount of blood leaves the heart per contraction. The ventricle contract is going to eject that blood, right? But in fact, not all of the blood leaves, not all of this end diastolic volume leave. If you're, most of us, usually about 50, 60% of the end diastolic volume leave, right? So if it's 120 ml, right, and it's 50%, that's your efficiency, that means 60 mLs leave. Now, if you are an athlete, you might go up to 80%, that's like 96 ml, right? And you might go, if you're really, really good, your stroke volume will be higher, like 90%, if you will, and not like 100 ml per volume. But so now the ventricle is at the end of its contraction, right? There's a volumes of blood at the end of the contraction. That volumes of blood is known as end systolic volume. End systolic volume. This is the volumes of blood at the end of the contraction, end systolic volume. Or you guys start learning this, that the end diastolic volume is equals to stroke volume plus end systolic volume. Okay? That's a good formula to know. So then, I mean, that's the basis for understanding the physiology of this heart. Okay, end diastolic volume is equal to stroke volume plus end systolic volume. Right? Anyone have a question with that? Okay. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the cardiac cycle. Cardiac cycle means all the events that occur from one contraction to the next contraction. We call it lubbed up, right? So in fact, actually, you know what? I think this is also very good to know. I'm going to share with you with the black screen. Sorry, a blank screen. Okay. Now, heart rate. What is our normal heart rate? Do you guys know? What's a normal heart rate? 60 to 100. Okay, good. I'm going to say 75 beats per minute. It's your average, 75 beats per minute. Right? The question is, if it's 75 beats a minute, how long is one beat? Can people figure it out? How long is one beat? Now, one beat is considered as one cardiac cycle. Same thing as one cardiac cycle. You can use your calculator to see if you can figure it out. If you don't know how to, I'll tell you. So 75 beats per minute is what you're saying is 75 beat in 1 minute, or 75 beat in 1 second. Sorry, in 60 seconds. 1 minute is 60 seconds, right? So if you take this and you divide this by 75, and you divide this by 75, so now you have 1 beat is equal to 0.8 seconds. Right? So lubbed up. So this cardiac cycle is about 0.8 seconds, less than 1 second. Right? So similarly, I think these are numbers you guys need to know. Someone earlier told me that the heart rate is between 60 and 100, right? Which is good. Now, if it's less than 60, we call that as bradycardia. Right? Now, if it's 100, more than 100, then it's tachycardia. Tachycardia. And the problem with the tachycardia is that it may not have sufficient time to be filled with blood, right? Now, if it's, let's say, 60 beats per minute, how long is 1 beat? Right? How long is 1 cardiac cycle? 1. So this, you divide this by 60, you divide it by this 60, so it'll be 1 beat in 1 second. That makes sense, right? So if there are 60 seconds in 1 minute, and there are 60 beat, then that means 1 beat is 1 second. Now let's say it's 100 beats per minute. How long is 1 beat? Right, so basically this is 60 seconds, right? And divide this by 100, the numerator and denominator, and you will find that 1 beat is about 0.6 seconds. So something has to give, right? So I mean, 1 minute is 1 minute interval is this much, right? So if you increase the numbers of beat, that means the cardiac cycle has to be shorter. Right? If the beat is low, the cardiac cycle will be longer. So that's the idea. You can see here how 60 beat per minute is good number to know. Is about 0.8 second. If your heart rate decrease, your cardiac cycle will be longer, 1 second. If your heart rate is increased, right, your cardiac cycle is shorter. I mean, you musicians will know that, right? So you can play, you have a tempo, like a full note. So what happened in a half note? You have to play faster. What's a quarter note? I don't know. You know, the idea is that a quarter note, meaning that there's 4 notes within that interval, right? And a half note is at 2. Yeah, that's the key. If you're training, you don't want. I can explain to you that next week. That's cardiovascular system, and that is there's 2 factors that regulate cardiac output, which is heart rate and stroke volume. And cardiac output must be increased if you're doing performance, right? Doing exercise. That's because you need more oxygen to your muscle. Now you can either increase the stroke volume or you can increase your heart rate to increase its cardiac output, but you cannot sustain increase in heart rate. So the alternative oftentimes is that for an athlete you want it to decrease. You train enough so you have, typically the desire is that a low resting heart rate. Right? And if you can run and your heart rate still maintain at 60 beats per minute, that's an athlete, right? And then you can run it for a long time. Yeah. Okay, so these number is really good, right? So we're going to come back to this if you want to understand the EKG. Right? So learn about this. Okay, so the cardiac cycle is divided into that 2 period, if you will. The first period, atrial systolic and ventricle diastolic. Doing that, the first period with the venous return, very important to note that most of the blood that coming back to the heart goes into the ventricle, right? Automatically, so passively, so that the atrioventricular valve must be open for blood to actually just go through the atria down to the ventricle, right? So that's 70% of blood. 30% of the blood that is get into that ventricle is coming from the atrial contraction. So the atrial contraction pushed the remaining 30% of the blood into the ventricle. So now you have a volumes of blood there. We call it that end diastolic volume. Right? Of course, during this time, the AV valve has to be open. The semilunar valve has to be closed. Right? So actually, ventricle relaxed. It's still going to be end diastolic volume. Now, one of the important thing that when we talk about the gas law, and this is known as the Boyle's gas law, and it applies here as well. Okay, Boyle gas law. What this gas law states that pressure is inversely proportional to volume. Okay? If the volume is decreased, that means you're dividing by a smaller number, the pressure will increase. Okay? Now, if the volume is increased, the pressure will decrease. Volume increase, pressure decrease. Right? Pressure is inversely proportional to volume. So if the volume decreased, the pressure increased. Okay, and so now when the ventricle relaxed, and then what happened is that the ventricle started to contract. Right. So let's say here's the ventricle. When the ventricle contract, as you can see, this is the volume I'm talking about. Okay. The ventricular space here during relaxation, and this is the ventricular space during the ventricle contraction. And you can see here is that the volume is getting smaller, right? This volume here and this is volume. The volume here means the space within the ventricle, okay? The ventricle squeezes like this. So you squeeze, right? So you can see the lumens getting smaller. The lumens getting smaller. That means inside of that, the pressure will be increased. Okay? So inside the ventricle, you're trying to increase it until it overrides what is exerted on that. On the left-hand side, it's called the aortic septal valve. Okay? So, all right, so what you see here is that there's a valve here that goes out. All right. So typically, if you measure pressure in the aorta, we call this systolic pressure 120 millimeters of mercury over 80 millimeters of mercury. And millimeters of mercury is known as the diastolic pressure. Okay. In other words, when the ventricle contracts, it's going to pushes the blood out. And when the ventricle now, see here's contract, it's going to push the blood out. And the ventricle relax, it's going to go back like this way. The blood's going to try to come back in, but it can't. It's stopped by that aortic septal valve. So the pressure here still remains at 80 millimeters of mercury. In fact, it's remaining as 80 millimeters of mercury, right? So if this pressure right here is 80 millimeters of mercury, right? What must the intraventricular pressure be to open up that valve? Does that make sense? Okay, here's another way of saying this. Let's say here's the aortic septal valve. Right now, on this side is 80 millimeters of mercury, the diastolic pressure. Okay. What must this be to open up the valve? What must the intraventricular, exactly, it has to be over 80, right? So when the ventricle, initially when they started to contract, the volume is getting smaller. The pressure is started to increase. We call this pressurizing. It's pressurizing so that it slowly increased from 40 to 50 to 60 to 70 to 80. And when it's 81, boom, it's open up, blood can gush out. But from 40 to 80, this thing's still closed, right? So that little short period is known as the pressure. You are pressurizing the intraventricular space, right? You causing it to, you increases the pressure within the ventricle. That's what pressurization means. Or people also define this as isovolumetric contraction. Iso because the volume hasn't changed yet. But is the ventricle contracting? Yes. Okay. So that's what they call this isovolumetric contraction. Iso contraction, it hasn't changed yet. The volume is still the same, which is the end diastolic volume. It hasn't changed yet. Okay? That's what the iso is. But it's just pressurizing. And by pressurizing is that you are increases the pressure from say 40 to, in this case, 80. right? If it's above 80, boom, it will open. Now the blood leave, and then the volume is going to change, right? It's no longer iso because blood leave, and the heart still contracting, and then boom, about 70 mLs of blood that comes out, and then it's relaxed again. So this is now the volumes of blood is stroke volume. The blood remain is the end systolic volume. All right. All right. That's a lot of information there. Let's review. In the cardiac cycle, there are two events that is happening. In one event, you get the venous return. Most of that blood that is coming back to the heart go through the atrium and down to the ventricle. The atrioventricular valves open, of course, and then you have the atrial contract to push the remaining blood into the heart. Now, the heart now it is fully ready to eject the volumes of blood. The blood that is found inside the ventricle is known as the end diastolic volume. Right there, it's ready to go. Right? Then the second event happened. This is the second event that happened. Now, the blood from the ventricle cannot go back to the atrium. This is just a one-way valve. So the AV valve is closed. And it's closed because I showed you earlier, the cusp is held on by the chordae tendineae, and the chordae tendineae is anchors to the papillary muscle. And when the papillary muscle contracts, it holds on to that chordae tendineae, and so that it prevents the cusp from blowing backward, right? So what I mean by that is, let's say here, right? Here are the cusps, the three cups on the right-hand side. The chordae tendineae, which is hold on to the papillary muscle. You can see that. So if the papillary muscle contract, which is basically, by the way, the ventricle contractors always start from the apex and it works its way up, okay, contraction. And the papillary muscle now contract. It's going to make this tight, and then if the intraventricular pressure here started to rise, right, but it doesn't allow blood to go into that way, because this is like, this is like a string that holds the tent down. So even though the wind is going through, the hurricane Sandy is going through, if you hold on to that rope really tight, your tent's not going to blow away, okay? Until this pressure is high enough, overrises on the right-hand side, pulmonary arterial valve. This valve open, and then blood can escape. All right, so you can say the chordae tendineae, actually here, the AV valve closed because the chordae tendineae prevent the cusp from bulging out. The atria relax, the blood flow. Now this blood here is the venous return. When the ventricles started to contract, the blood in the started to coming back into the atria, okay, during the relaxation. This is different blood from this blood. This is the venous return blood for the next cycle, if you will. The ventricular pressure increase, right, just increases up to that diastolic pressure. So we call that pressurizing, or make sure you know that, okay? Pressurizing. And pressurizing is the same thing as isovolumetric contraction. Because this is the contraction, it's a short period of time, all right? But it allows the blood hasn't changed yet. It just allows the ventricular pressure to increase, right? And then blood in the ventricle leave when it overrises that aortic valve. It will leave. Okay. Now here's a here's an important question for you to ask. And then we'll take a 5-minute break. Okay, so the question is this. What is the question? What is the danger of someone has chronic hypertension? All right, so chronic hypertension, I'm talking to you, is that, so someone has blood pressure of 104, sorry, let's say 160 millimeters of mercury over 90 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so you guys take a 5-minute break and see if you can answer this question for me. Okay? Hypertension. What is the danger of someone have chronic hypertension? Yeah, it does increase the risk, but mechanistically, why is there an increased risk?